Welcome, everyone. Today, we're moving past the idea that budgeting is just about balancing the agency's books. We will see that budgeting is a management philosophy and that we should think of the budget format as the genetic code for government behavior. If the code focuses on compliance, managers worry about the cost of, say, pencils, papers, travel funds. But we have this new mindset. The shift is if the code focuses on performance, the conversation shifts to, for example, literacy rates and patients cured. So we are moving from counting inputs to buying outcomes. So now let's navigate this shift. We looked at four primary archetypes. We have the line item budgeting, which is the traditional model focused on control and inputs. Second, we have the program budgeting. This is considered a strategic model focused on objectives and efficiency. Third, we have the zero-based budgeting, considered the radical model that assumes a starting budget of zero to cut out dead wood. We'll explain that further later. Performance budgeting is considered the standard for modern management, where funds follow results and autonomy is traded for accountability. So let's take a deep dive on each of our types of budget. First, we have the line item, the architecture of control. This model lists specific objects like salary, travel, and fuel, for example. The pros for this approach is it's very easy to audit. It prevents theft because every peso is easily tracked. The cons is that it is incredibly rigid. If a manager has extra money in office supplies line item, they cannot easily move it to hire the needed consultant. It tells you what was bought, but never the why. Most especially the regionals comes between transferring funds from the personal services to MOE and back, transferring from MOE to PS. It's quite strict and basically you're not allowed to just move funds from one line item to another in this type of budgeting. Next is program budgeting. Program budgeting groups those inputs into a single bucket. Like for example, the maternal health program. So instead of just line item one by one, we group each item into per program. So here, the shift is that policymakers can finally see the total cost of a government goal rather than scattered items. So the key tool here would be the use of cost-benefit analysis to ensure allocative efficiency. So we can now, through this approach, see whether the cost of conducting the maternal health program justifies the benefits that we receive from the maternal health program. Next, we move on to the radical reset called zero-based budgeting. So most budgets are incremental. If some of you here has already more or less prepared budgets year by year, you know that we usually take last year's amount and then just add a little for inflation. So here in zero-based budgeting, it's called the Hatchet-Man of Finance because every single peso must be re-justified from scratch. The strategic relevance of this approach is that if our agency has been spending 300,000 a year on encyclopedias since 1997, zero-based budgeting will cut that as obsolete, as we now do not really use encyclopedias, rarely use encyclopedias. So that money, the 300,000, can be redirected to something with strategic relevance, such as, for example, an AI research center. So the trade-off is that this approach eliminates the dead wood. It can also cause reform fatigue, can burn out the personnel because the work can be quite exhausting. Because in a way, agencies are required to justify everything every single year. Finally, we go to the standard, which is performance-based budgeting. So the deal here is that agencies get lump sum flexibility. That is, they have the freedom to move money between line items in exchange for strict accountability. Agencies must hit targets such as vaccinating 90% of infants. So let's look at the global benchmark, which is the New Zealand's purchase model. We take a look at the New Zealand's 1989 Public Finance Act, where you have a purchaser and a supplier. So the ministers in New Zealand, which is actually ministry in New Zealand, is actually the department here in the Philippines. So the minister buys services, for example, processing of 100,000 passports, and the agency's CEO supplies them. So the consequences is that the CEO has full autonomy over hiring and firing. But if they fail to deliver, they get fired. If they succeed, they get a bonus. So let's look at the local context, which is the Philippine PREX and the GAD, Gender and Development. So what is PREX? This is the Program Expenditure Classification implemented in 2018. So this reform tackled fragmentation. As before, funds for example, rice self-sufficiency program were scattered across the BPI, Bureau of Plant Industry, Irrigation and Fertilizer authorities. So now, the General Appropriations Act is organized by program, making the total cost or true cost visible to both policymakers and the public. So let's visualize the shift from line item to programs. So the old line item view is, you have here personal services, salary of the doctor, MOE, the purchase of the medicines, and let's say the use of the ambulance, the fuel needed to run the ambulance, classified as MOE. So it's quite opaque. But with the program expenditure classification, we have a more transparent approach, because the salary, the medicine, the fuel will now be classified as part of the maternal health program. To achieve the outcome target of reduction of maternal mortality ratio of 90 is to 100,000. So the key takeaway here is that transparency drives accountability. Another program on the local scene is the gender and development budgeting. Government employees here have more or less experienced a GAD program in their work history, because government is quite strict in the 5% rule. That is, at least 5% of the total budget must be allocated to GAD. So it doesn't mean that every 5% will entirely be spent on GAD activities such as trainings and seminars, more or less, most of the time. But we also have the concept of attribution. So in this example, how do you prove that a road project helps women? So through attribution, by justifying that if the road includes well-lit sidewalks for safety and restrooms verified by a checklist, it will be attributed and counted to the 5%. The checklist is found in some call this Hagad-Dagad, but it's the HGDG manual that helps facilitate whether a program is attributable to the GAD budget. So enforcement, strict audit by COA. So non-compliance with GAD is actually a very easy audit findings for most COA auditors. So let's have a simple simulation applying the models. For example, challenge 1, let's apply the zero-based budgeting. So if you're the budget officer, you're starting from zero. So you must identify what are the legacy costs. So let's compare typewriter maintenance contract for 100,000. Second is travel budget for Boracay conference, 2 million. Which item gets cut? Budget officer sees which is obsolete and no longer necessary to achieve its programs. Most probably the typewriter maintenance contract will be cut off from the total budget, as most agencies now use computers. Challenge 2, let's use the PREX classification. So let's reorganize the Barangay Health Center budget. So the Barangay Health Center project, Health Center has the following programs: maternal and child care program, and infectious disease control program. So we have the following items. Which program will be using the ambulance fuel? Most probably the infectious disease program. Midwife salary, that will go to the maternal and child care program. Vaccines will go to infectious disease control program. Going back to ambulance fuel, it could also be both. But basically, you just allocate each of these expense items to the correct program of a specific agency. So in conclusion, budgeting is a balancing act in terms of control, line item and zero-based budgeting prevents theft and cuts waste. In terms of value, program and performance model fund goals and outcomes. So our final takeaway from this lesson would be the best system doesn't choose one. It blends financial control with management flexibility.